morning. Today I'll be presenting on Scott Chantler's Two Generals, examining reflexivity and memory and the role that paratextuality and intertextuality play in narrative structure, and unpacking iconography throughout graphics text. If we were to examine Scott Chantler's first page of narrative text, some of the ways that we might read it are by analyzing the 9-panel structure of the grid as an internal rhythm, its symbolic coloration, cues as to militaristic genre, framing the character as vulnerable through its distancing, and the church icon. The church is almost an anomalous element on this page. Its composition is so starkly different than that of any of the surrounding panels. The reader's eyes are instantly drawn to it, almost pulled out of the linear sequence. But what does this mean? For the purposes of this presentation, I'll be using the term icon in the sense that Peirce defines it as an image that may be abstract or representative. The church's coloration is in black and white, which may signify a different time, a flash forward, a flash back, a memory. We can associate it to the internal state of the character, as the character is the only other main focus on the page. We might read it symbolically as a place of sanctuary or faith, and it appears in a borderless panel, which also suggests a kind of timelessness or a stopping of time, which may also symbolize death or the cessation of breath. So today's focus, I'd like to particularly focus on the rendition of the church icon as it manifests itself across Chantler's Two Generals to suggest how the reader creates layers of symbolic complexity through paratext, intertext, and arthrological connection to interpret the thematic overtones of the text, such as remembrance and reanimation. I further suggest that the author uses paratext, composition, and intertextuality as a framing device for the overall structure and interpretation of the text and the author's role within that text. So let's take a look at the cover. Paratextuality indicates the presence of a material surrounding the primary text. This is the cover, the title, the book jackets, and they're all substantial to the external conditions of the text, which the reader can't ignore. In the case of Chantler's Two Generals, a paratext is doing important work regarding the influencing of the reader's interpretation of the main text, and the multiple meanings that can be associated to the iconography in that text. So if we just look at the cover picture, the careful reader will notice that the church icon on page 5 is not the first instance that the reader encounters this depiction of the church. The symbolic work of the church is already being established in the paratext on the book's cover. If we examine this picture more closely, we can start making associations to the symbolic or the thematic role of that church icon. Some of the associations we can make from this paratextual image come from the title, which indicates several things. The word two indicates a relationship between two people, a relationship that will end up forming the core of the book. The word generals also indexes the militaristic overtones of this text, which we can start seeing from things like what we come to recognize as the World War II uniforms, which further index a time period, a genre, that the book will be situated in the genre of warfare. But the prevalence or the priority will be proportionally given to the anonymous figures in the foreground. The fact that you can't see the faces of the anonymous figures in the foreground indicates their interchangeability and their mortality, which is emphasized by their anonymity. Their outcome as soldiers is emphasized by the graveyard in the background, which is also associated to the church icon. Now, in the background, it's comparatively small as it's surrounded by the foreground of the graveyard, connoting the icon further away from an image of respite or sanctuary, and one that is closer associated to death. As the picture is rendered in sepia, as opposed to the black and white that we see on the first narrative page, it also indicates that this memory is linked to a lived event and does not just function as an icon of death. So when we open the book, before we get to the first page of main text, we encounter an epigraph that is part of the paratext. The epigraph in this case is Thomas Gray's poem, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. This poem's inclusion as a part of the paratext also functions as a valuable intertext for the two generals, framing the structure of the novel, the reader's expectations, the thematic content of the text, the author's role, and the symbolism of the church icon. A little bit about this poem. It was written by Thomas Gray in about 1751. Its genre is elegy or graveyard poetry, and it's about mediations on death, fear of death, and remembrance of the individual after death. The poem argues that remembrance can be good and bad, and that there's a comfort in pondering over the unknown peasants buried in the churchyard. So for intertextuality, I use Gerard Genette's definition of it as a relationship of co-presence between two texts or amongst several texts. And adding another layer of intertextuality to the inclusion of this poem in Chantler's work is that Gray's poem was actually transcribed into his grandfather, Law Chantler's diary, from which much of the Two Generals is based. So just to read the poem, can storied urn or animated bust back to its mansion called a fleeting breath? Can honor's voice provoke the silent dust, or flattery soothe the dull cold ear of death? Perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire, hands that rod of empire might have swayed, or waked to ecstasy the living lyre. So Gray's poem is also an intertext unto itself to several influential works of his day, including Dante's and Milton's texts, which adds another layer of complexity to the symbolism already incorporated into Chantler's text. So if we break this down line by line, can storied urn or animated bust is an adaptation of Milton's coinage and storied windows richly dight, where it means painted with stories, that is, histories. This is what the artist is doing, literally illustrating the story that follows in the poem, a history which is also in memoriam. Back to its mansion called the fleeting breath, where fleeting breath metaphorically stands for the spirit and mansion in terms of the body. However, when we take these two lines together, we get the self-reflection nature of the text itself. So the question, can storied urn or animated bust back to its mansion called the fleeting breath, structures the author's textual dilemma in a self-reflexive and self-conscious declaration of his intention. Can his depiction of his grandfather's story reanimate the people it's based on? MacLeod's concept of closure, the creation of fluid action in the reader's mind through fragmentary images, suggests that it's possible to reanimate the picture of these two lives through static rendered images of a life and through the reader's interpretation across webs of meaning. This line prefaces the construction of this dominating structural element of the text, the 9-paneled grid, which, according to Chantler, serves to connote the breathing action itself, a connotation emphasized by the inhalation of smoke in the first page. The fact that the protagonist still breathes in the first panel suggests much of the trauma he faces and will face as he ruminates about death, the churchyard, the elegy, the poem, all further implied by that symbolic and staggering index of the graveyard and the church on which the poem also resides. Can honor's voice provoke the silent dust or flattery soothe the dull cold ear of death? The meaning he attaches to honor's voice or to words of speeches in honor of the dead is also referenced in Richard Blackmore's poem On Fame. Do morrows smile when we extol his lay, or Tully listen to his earned praise? Do shouts of triumph soothe great Caesar's ear, or fame, young Ammon, thy cold ashes cheer? Suggests another self-reflexive question that the author has. Can transcribing or illustrating the story to make it known appease the memories or the lives of those who fought and died in battle? Perhaps in this neglected spot, some heart once pregnant with celestial fire is laid. I mixed that up. This line comes from another poem which marks that the philosopher, the saint, or the hero, the wise, the good, or the great man very often lie hid and concealed in a plebeian, where celestial fire connotes the divinity of the spirit. These lines suggest that in this historical and warfare genre, where we expect to get stories and great allusions of great men like Caesar, alluded to in the previous lines of the poem, the text is really about the depiction of ordinary men who have intersected with the extraordinary events of world history. Men that lived and breathed and concealed in the private lives their private genius. And in the final lines we get, and hands the rod of empire might have swayed, or waked to ecstasy the living lyre. Here we have a mixture of the figurative and the real, which are not only at work in the poem, but also across the text to follow. This is the plight of the lyre, the creation of song, the story, and of art. This is the artist's role to pass down the story. He is prefacing his role for us. Can remembering really bring someone back to life? Honor them? For while a story, true story, memory, it's a subject to the medium of the interpretation that the artist gives it. as reminded to us by the author himself at the end of the text, with the inclusion of a drawn photograph of a real photograph. Through the intertextual inclusion of Gray's poem, the author not only infuses the church icon with thematic symbolism of death and mortality articulated by the poem, but also asks the text's central and self-reflective question: can the author breathe life back into these people who are dead and gone? As one of the author's final panels suggests, yes, and in fact, it's a hell of a thing to have brought two men back to life, however briefly. This is not the only revelation the author has in store at the end of the book. He also reveals the circumstances which allow the reader to create the final unpacking of the church icon. The next time we see this church icon after the opening scenes of the book is when we see the bombardment of the HLI company commanders. In this scene of carnage, the 9-panel grid is prevalently interrupted by a borderless church icon. The church icon's mere positionality next to such carnage functions to visually associate the icon with death. However, the church icon as such carries forward with it, through such archaeological connections to the previous paratext, all that it has connoted with the cover image and the intertextuality of the poem. This connective braiding technique, as defined by Gronstein, puts every panel in potential, if not actual, relation with every other, leading to such a densification of detail. The church icon further signifies a moment of timelessness, a cessation of breath. However, the composition of the page places the church icon in a complete frame around Jack Chrysler, which helps the reader understand this moment as Jack Chrysler's moment of death. Just at that moment of framing Jack Chrysler's death, the author reveals the final signification of this church icon by revealing what it has meant to the main character, Law, who reflects on this icon throughout the text. In the last panel on page 122 and the first panel on page 123, we see this repeated with a difference. There. The caption on the church also reads, at this point, Stokes Pogue's England, 1943, indicating to the reader a different temporality from the church icon on the previous page. The icon is also rendered in sepia tones this time, indicating it is no longer a memory of the event, but the actual event itself. The church icon now does not represent just any church or specific associations that the reader brings to the icon of church, but represents a specific site in England, a specific church, one Law visited with Jack, this church. Significantly, this memory is not just of Law's time at the church in Stokes Pogue's England, but rather signifies the time he spent there with Jack, and so his relationship with Jack, which is the real matter at the heart of the text, the meaning indicated at the outset of the text by the very word to in the title. It's on page 123 that Law discovers the poem at this church site, which is included in the paratext and intertext, and which carries forward with it its thematic overtones to the interpretation of the word. Law says, "It says here that this is where Thomas Gray wrote Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. It's a poem about a body in a graveyard. In this graveyard, apparently. It's about how life had many joys, even for someone who's barely remembered. And what really matters is friendship, and being mourned by the people who cared for you in life." The inclusion of this scene, unpacking how it is the church icon came to signify a significant moment in Law Chantler's memory, changes the reader's regard for all previous cases of this specific icon throughout the text. The icon does not only serve a reminder to the reader of the thematic overtones of the text, death, mortality, respite, sanctuary, but a lived relationship. It comes to stand in for the actual poem itself. Once again, we have a repetition of the church icon across the double page spread, and once again, it is a repetition with a difference. The reader moves from a page where the icon is represented in a 1/9 grid frame in sepia tones, as perhaps the last view Law Chantler takes of the actual church, to that of a full-page borderless panel, spread out, zoomed in, showing the entire church and part of the graveyard in black and white, larger than life. As Gronstein notes, the difference in area between two panels indicates the importance, weight, and timing of the actual image itself, and makes those connections throughout the text, including the paratext. The reading time is significantly paused on this final page, as perhaps one reads this image as one would read the poem associated with it in the paratext. In this 3-page synctum, you are reading these panels in connection to each other. Across the page turn, we see the residual image of the church icon, which is literally positioned on the back of page 126, a page which is composed of the full page panel that we connect back to the opening scene of the story as the church icon made its first appearance. And we realize that Law is looking back, just as we must look back through the previous pages of the text in order to make sense of it all. Perhaps this is Law's way of reanimating his friend by ruminating on the memory they shared together, a memory that is sketched in black and white when Law Chantler faces some of the most traumatic events of his life, which recalls the theme of the poem in the paratext. Is remembering enough to keep someone alive? Is it enough to honor a friend or fallen soldier with remembrance? Does this remembrance ease our fear of death? And that's how the paratext, poem, and the last pages of the text function as bookends, with the church icon acting as the glue or frame, the in-between, creating the content and connection for the structural framework of the text, and asking the author's essential self-reflective question: can story urn or animated bust back to its mansion called a fleeting breath? The author's opening reflexive question by way of the intertextual reference of the poem in the paratext is that these stories are handed down to us, so must we hand them down, lest such delicate personal lines be lost amongst the greater strokes of history. Because after all, like the poem asks and Chantler's text suggests, isn't that what life is really about? Not great men, but simply men who did great things, things we have an obligation to remember. Thank you.
I have a sort of a multi-part question that just goes across the board. And it pulls on a couple of ideas that you were talking about, Irene. But I think it's broadly applicable here. First of all, you notice how paratext sort of can identify a genre or sort of identify thematic elements of a story. Does demystification or that kind of paratext, does that then index for us comics as a medium? Is sort of an initial question, or at least comics as a medium post Stan and Jack, starting with Fantastic Four #1 and the editor's notes and that sort of thing. And then sort of along those lines, do you discuss this idea of sort of braiding the panels through, right, to sort of create this sort of sense of world building or however you want to frame it as a reflexive act? Does that also work for us then across product lines, right? So for as an example, like the first thought that jumped to my head when you were showing us all those panels of the church is the scene of Bruce Wayne's parents, and then there's the street light, and it's made very famous by the Frank Miller drawing. So or Mazzucchelli. So we see that across the line, and that's an indicator of what's happening here. We sort of see the same thing with Uncle Ben and Spider-Man or Gwen Stacy or something like that. So so can we take these ideas and take them from the individualized units you're talking about, but apply them much more broadly, and then if you can, sort of expand on how we might be able to do that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think you definitely can, especially to answer the first part of your question. In Europe, really, comics are seen as the ninth art, right? The construction is disseminated, it's known, it's a part of the press, it's a part of the process of comics and of understanding comics outside of the monograph text or the serialized text. And I think with comics showing part of its construction, its self-reflexivity, its authorial reflexivity, it is starting to broaden that idea of construction that not just goes into any singular text, but as we start seeing in the Marvel universes, co-constructed text, company text, in order to illuminate that art, period, is constructed, and this is an art form to be constructed and to be questioned as to its objectivity, subjectivity.
I mean, in terms of what you're talking about, we're getting into issues both of intermediality, so across different media, and questions of intertextuality. And then there's also, it's a fascinating connection to arthrology, to me, to Gronstein's conception, because what you talked about, that image of Bruce Wayne's parents, when I teach a history of comics course, one of the things I show this supercut of, you can find it on YouTube, the supercut of every animated or live action version of them dying at the beginning. And it's got some similar shots that go across. And then I show 3 versions of the origin, and you can see the images that work from one to the next. And it's interesting when the pearls that fall, which are now part of what we think of with that origin story, but that doesn't come in until Frank Miller.
Right.
But now that's absolutely part of what happens.
Right.
I think that works as a
Theater's very much part of it too.
yeah, a densification of that detail. Because we have that in our memory, we can web it back to that time and say, in one image, because as Dale shows that in class, we actually get a densification. It goes from many panels to fewer panels to all of a sudden just one cover that tells you the entire story.
That's all
But
you
we
need.
track back in history as fans or as insiders to that.
Yeah, and I think as comic book readers, Gronstein talks about the way comics are a web, right? So that's how arthrology works. You make sense from comics by making connections between the various webs, both in sequence and in distance in the comic. But I think the other thing that happens, we've talked about Jeanette today, you make sense of comics also by the connections in the web you make out to other texts, whether that's through intertextuality or what he calls architectuality, which is genre, or these different connections. So I think making meaning in comics is all about all the different connections you create.
Right. And then but so many of those connections are part of this demystification
Yes,
process as
a
well.
lot of them. But it was really interesting, just for,
Yeah.
listening to Sergio Aragonés speak, because he said twice, I don't want to pull people out of the universe, which is absolute. So there's a lot of people that they don't, right? That's a fiction writer. You make a decision. Do you want to keep the person in your universe, or do you want to do things to show the seams, to pull them out? And you have to do that for a reason. Whether that works or not is different, but there has to be a reason for pulling people out. That makes sense. Go ahead.
I'm interested broadly in the claim that comics are by their nature reflexive. I think, Jay, you brought that up.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering the force of it. Is it that comics are exceptionally reflexive? I mean, like, is there a comparative valuation, versus like literary prose? Is that less reflexive than comics, or is there?
Well, it depends on the prose you're getting at. Like, a lot of creative nonfiction itself is also reflexive too. Like, if you read Dewdney's Acquainted with the Night, just about every single chapter in that, he says, I'm sitting in my room looking at night and writing this right now.
So it's not something new.
It's not something just that the comics have, but it is also appeared quite frequently in comics, like in a way of trying to connect readers, as Dale was saying, and trying to inform them what is happening. Or in what I was dealing with was a lot of creative nonfiction comics itself, where they're showing it themselves, how they're creating it, or just in a way of showing that this is a construction. Because it is a construction. Even when it's dealing with reality, it is a reconstruction of reality. So they're showing the sense that it's supposed to be created.
Can I add to this? I think because comics allow for so many other intermedia documents, maps, pictures of photographs, actual photographs, film strips, it starts becoming a bit collage because you are privy to both image and text working collaboratively, really within a comic, that it can create so much more self-reflexivity or reflexivity in comics in general, because you have so many intermedia connections into them.
With commercial comics, with flocks, and it doesn't matter what genre, when you have advertisements, that brings you out of the story. So, it's not anything that they want, but it's going to happen as you read it. When none of us got to the reader awareness, is what Matthew Jones talks about. You can't help but have that. It's not as much there in a graphic novel or trade paperback when you don't have that part of it, but certainly in commercial comics. You can't forget that this is a commercial product. You never forget that.
Yeah, it seems like comics have distinctive modes by which to express reflexivity. Perhaps that's a good way of putting it.
Well, it's also a blending of different mediums. Like, it's image, but it's also text at the same time. So.
Cool. Okay, well, I think that's going to do us for time. We've got one more panel coming up, but thank you all. This was really good.